He laughed after calling her worthless, right there in class, with 30 students watching. But what none of them expected was that the quiet girl he mocked would turn the entire school against him, without ever raising her voice. And by the time it was over, the only thing louder than his apology was the silence that followed. Raya Mendoza didn't need anyone to remember her name. Just getting through the day without being noticed was enough. At Jefferson High, where cliques ruled and reputations were built on noise, she moved like a shadow, silent and small, always avoiding eye contact, always fading into the background. She wore thrifted hoodies 2 sizes too big, kept her head down, and spent lunch alone behind the school's old greenhouse, sketching in a duct-tape notebook that held a world where she had a voice. In her drawings, she was anything but invisible. Her characters were fierce, sharp-eyed girls with swords and scars, girls who didn't flinch when someone yelled their name across the room. But outside the pages, Raya spoke only when she had to. She'd learned early that attention came with a cost. And after her father left and her mother began working night shifts just to keep the lights on, she had no energy to fight battles that didn't pay off. She wasn't poor enough to be pitied or odd enough to be noticed, just a quiet girl with too many library books and headphones that weren't even plugged in half the time. That's why the moment hit so hard. 4th period English. Ms. Lambert asked for someone to interpret a metaphor in the story they'd read, and Raya, nervous but determined, raised her hand. She spoke softly, making a thoughtful point about ancestral grief and hidden strength, drawing on a Filipino myth her grandmother once told her. The room actually listened. For a second, she didn't feel small, until Mason Carr leaned back in his seat and muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Okay, TED Talk, relax. Nobody cares what the background character thinks." A few students laughed, quick, reflexive, like they didn't want to be next. He glanced around, smirking. "Seriously, Mendoza, what are you even doing in this class? You're not honors. You're not even relevant. You're kind of worthless." The word hit like a slap, not because he shouted it, but because of how easily it slipped from his mouth, like it was obvious. Ms. Lambert's weak. "Mason, that's enough," wasn't even a speed bump. Raya didn't say anything. She just looked down at her desk, face burning, and didn't speak for the rest of the day. But that night, in her bedroom lit by the yellow desk lamp her mom found at a garage sale, Raya flipped open her sketchbook, not to escape, but to record. And in the middle of that page, she started drawing Mason's face, not as he looked now, but as he would look when he finally realized he had underestimated the wrong girl. For the next week, Raya said nothing, but she watched everything. Every time Mason Carr strutted into a classroom, cracked a joke at someone's expense, or hijacked a discussion like he owned the floor, she took mental notes. She wasn't the only one he mocked. He interrupted a girl presenting her science project, sneered at a freshman's stutter during a group read, even made fun of a substitute teacher's accent while the class laughed along. And what infuriated her more than his words was the way people let him get away with it. Teachers dismissed it as sarcasm. Classmates called it just Mason being Mason. The injustice chewed at her every night while she sketched it all out in her notebook, page after page of what everyone else chose to ignore. But it wasn't enough to draw it. She needed to show it. That's when the idea began to take shape. Raya started researching, quietly, methodically, how to edit videos, how to overlay audio on slideshow clips, how to pull archived live streams from the school's public events page. She found a free editing app on her school Chromebook and spent nights piecing together something that didn't just vent her frustration. It told a story. A story of patterns, of harm disguised as humor, of a boy who weaponized charm and confidence to control a room. She clipped together footage from assemblies where Mason spoke over other students, debate meets where he steamrolled softer-spoken opponents, screenshots of tweets and comments that vanished too quickly to report, but not before someone like her saved them. But the centerpiece was audio. After school one day, she slipped her phone into her hoodie pocket and sat near Mason's usual lunch table. He didn't notice her. No one ever did. And that's when she got it. Mason bragging about checking girls off the list, mocking Raya's voice, laughing that he could say whatever he wanted and they'd still make him student body president. It was more than a pattern. It was proof. Raya didn't know exactly how it would end, but she knew how it would start. With him hearing his own words in front of everyone. She just needed the right moment. And Mason, for all his arrogance, handed it to her a few days later when he announced his campaign to run for senior class president, complete with a school-wide assembly, live streamed from the auditorium, hosted by the AV Club. All she had to do was wait. The announcement hit on Monday morning like a drum roll. Bold letters on the bulletin board outside the main office. Candidate assembly, this Friday at 10 a.m. Vote for your future. Mason Carr's campaign posters went up by lunch. A smug headshot, the slogan confidence, charisma, Carr, in bold red text, and a QR code linking to a curated Instagram page filled with filtered photos, fake smiles, and testimonials from friends who'd never sat at the bottom of his jokes. The school buzzed. Teachers praised his leadership. Students reposted his videos, laughed at his punchlines, and talked like his win was inevitable. But not everyone was smiling. Raya saw the way Jordan in her lit class flinched when Mason entered the room, how Kayla from chemistry didn't speak up anymore after he mocked her once during a lab. She saw how silence had spread like mold in their school, and how his voice always seemed to fill the vacuum. That week, Raya became invisible on purpose, fading into corners, sliding past open doors, gathering the final pieces. She'd already clipped the worst audio, Mason talking about how dumb girls will vote for him because he's hot, how teachers eat out of his hand. And now she needed just one more thing, access. So she joined the AV Club. No one questioned her. The club advisor, Mr. Eaton, was thrilled to have someone volunteer to help with the live stream, and Jeremy, the only other student on tech duty, barely looked up from his laptop when she arrived. Assembly slideshows all loaded, he mumbled. Just don't unplug anything. Raya smiled, nodded, and slipped the USB drive into her pocket. She had encoded her video file to look like a slideshow backup, just in case anyone checked. She wasn't trying to humiliate Mason for revenge. She wanted accountability. She wanted the people who let it happen to see what they'd ignored for so long. Friday came fast. As Mason practiced his speech in the mirror-lined hall near the stage, adjusting his tie like he already owned the title, Raya sat in the tech booth above the auditorium, heart racing, fingers shaking slightly over the controls. Below her, students filed in by the dozens, phones out, eyes forward. The moment was coming, and for once, Raya Mendoza wasn't scared to be seen. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., the lights in the auditorium dimmed, and Principal Hardy stepped onto the stage with a practiced smile, clipboard in hand. He welcomed the students, said a few words about civic participation, and then introduced the only candidate running, Mason Carr. Applause erupted, not wild, but loud enough to feed his ego as he walked confidently to the podium in a navy blazer and too white smile. "Thanks, guys," he began, voice smooth as silk. "I think we all know this school deserves leadership that listens, understands, and above all, respects." Raya's finger hovered over the cue button. She waited. Mason launched into his rehearsed speech, hitting every generic promise: longer lunch breaks, better Wi-Fi, more student input. People started zoning out. That's when Raya acted. She switched the input feed. For a second, the screen behind Mason blinked black. Then, without warning, the slideshow flickered, and a new video began playing. Clear audio of Mason's voice laughing. "Girls at this school are like sheep. You give them a smile and they'll do whatever you want." Confused murmurs filled the room. Mason turned, saw his own face appear in a hallway recording, him mocking a substitute teacher's accent, calling another student irrelevant, bragging about manipulating teachers. "They're so desperate to believe I'm a good guy, they'll ignore anything." The room froze. On screen, text flashed. "These are his words. These are our hallways. This is what you let slide." For the first time, Mason looked genuinely afraid. "What the hell is this?" he barked, turning toward the tech booth. But the damage was done. Students stared. Some were filming. Others whispered names, recognizing the voices he had torn down. Principal Hardy was yelling to shut off the screen, but Jeremy, blinking in confusion, just looked at Raya. She stood still, headphones on, calm. "Play it through," she said. "They need to hear all of it." The final clip played. Mason, recorded just a week ago, saying, "Even if someone speaks up, who's going to believe them over me?" That's when the silence hit. Not empty, but heavy. Embarrassed. Exposed. The lights flicked back on. Mason looked out at the crowd, and for the first time in his life, no one clapped. No one smiled. No one saved him. And in the AV booth above it all, Raya finally looked down and met his eyes. Mason tried to recover, but his voice cracked under the weight of silence. "It was edited," he shouted, eyes darting between faculty and students. "It's out of context. You guys know me. I joke around." But the room wasn't laughing. Even the principal looked stunned, holding his phone like he was just now realizing how bad it was. Raya watched from above, chest tight, unsure if she was about to be dragged into the principal's office or applauded. She didn't care either way. All that mattered was that the truth had been heard. As the assembly dissolved into murmurs and side-eyes, Raya slipped quietly out of the booth, blending into the crowd as Mason stormed off stage. By lunchtime, the video had already gone viral across the school's unofficial group chat, spreading like wildfire. Comments exploded. "Did you hear what he said? My brother's in that clip. Why didn't anyone stop him sooner?" For once, Raya wasn't invisible. People she'd never spoken to glanced her way with quiet recognition. Not all of it was kind. Some whispered that she went too far, or that she must have been obsessed with him to keep all that. But others, like Kayla from chemistry, caught her eye in the hallway and gave a small, knowing nod. Even Jordan, the shy kid Mason used to mock during debates, stopped her near the vending machines. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "For all of us." That hit harder than applause ever could. But the backlash came quick. By the next day, Mason's parents had called the school demanding disciplinary action for slander. A meeting was scheduled. Some teachers backed away from Raya, avoiding eye contact. Her mom got a message from the school board asking if she'd authorized any media distribution through school systems. It was intimidation, dressed in bureaucratic politeness. Raya didn't flinch. She uploaded the raw files to a backup cloud, sent copies to herself, to a cousin in California, even emailed an anonymous tip to a local teen journalist who'd covered school board hypocrisy in the past. They couldn't erase the truth. She wouldn't let them. But the storm was still gathering. And in its center, a girl who used to eat lunch alone behind the greenhouse was quietly preparing for the next wave, because she knew Mason Carr wasn't going to apologize willingly. But when he did, it was going to be loud. By Monday, Jefferson High was divided. Some still defended Mason, blaming cancel culture and calling Raya a liar, even though his voice was in every clip. Others, especially those who'd been on the receiving end of his cruelty, started speaking up. Anonymous posts surfaced online with stories from students too scared to come forward before. How Mason had blackmailed a sophomore over private messages. How he'd sabotaged a girl's student council campaign with fake rumors. The pattern was undeniable. But the administration wasn't moving fast. There were no public statements, no consequences. Principal Hardy called Raya into his office, trying to keep the tone light. "We understand you had good intentions, Raya, but this kind of action disrupts the school environment." She stared at him without blinking. "So does letting someone bully people for 3 years," she replied. He didn't have a comeback. The meeting ended with a vague promise to review the evidence and an offer for Raya to take a few days off to cool down. She declined. Instead, she got to work. She contacted Ms. Avery, the only teacher who ever asked about her sketchbook. Turned out, Ms. Avery had her own file, written complaints she'd submitted to the administration over the years about Mason's behavior, all ignored. Together, they compiled everything: the recordings, screenshots, the silent pattern of staff complicity. With Ms. Avery's help, they drafted a formal complaint to the district superintendent and added signatures from 12 other students who had stayed quiet until now. Raya didn't stop there. She reached out to that teen journalist she tipped off earlier, Jules Reyes, a senior with a sharp pen and a big platform. Jules agreed to run the story. "People need to know this isn't just about Mason," she said. "It's about everyone who let him get away with it." Raya nodded. That's what it had become. Not just one boy's cruelty, but a whole system built to protect him. Her plan wasn't revenge, it was exposure, accountability, truth. And while the administration stalled behind closed doors, she knew the real trial would be public. She didn't need to force Mason to apologize, not yet. All she had to do was keep building pressure. And the moment it cracked, she'd be ready to make sure the whole school heard what he had to say. The story dropped on Thursday morning, front page of the Jefferson Sentinel's digital edition. Charisma or control? Students speak out against school's golden boy. Jules had done her homework. The article included redacted quotes from students, blurred screenshots of private messages, and a side-by-side timeline of complaints filed and ignored. Within hours, the link had spread across every group chat in school. Parents started calling the front office. Alumni posted on Facebook. Even a local radio host mentioned it in the morning segment. By lunch, Principal Hardy released a terse email announcing a temporary suspension of Mason Carr from student leadership duties and a pending investigation into allegations of misconduct. But it was too late for damage control, because that day during fourth period, Mason walked into school like nothing had happened. He wasn't wearing his usual smug grin, but he still held his head high. That is, until he stepped into the cafeteria. It wasn't what he expected. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones rose quietly. He stood in the center, surrounded not by laughter but by silence, the heavy kind that knows everything. Raya was already there, sitting in the back corner with her sketchbook open, drawing, headphones in. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The air told her enough. Then something happened no one anticipated. Jordan, the shy kid from lit class, stood up and walked over to Mason. "You remember calling me a stuttering little joke during mock trials?" he asked, voice trembling. Mason opened his mouth, but Jordan didn't wait. "You said I'd never be taken seriously. Now half the school believes me over you." Then Kayla joined him, then two others. A line began to form. One by one, students stepped forward, not yelling, not attacking, just naming the moment Mason made them feel small. His face drained, his posture shrank. And when he turned to leave, he saw Mr. Benson, the history teacher he used to interrupt for sport, standing by the door, not stopping him, just watching. That quiet judgment said more than any punishment could. For the first time, Mason Carr realized he couldn't outrun what he'd done. And when his father stormed into the school later that afternoon demanding his son's good name be cleared, all he found was a principal who'd seen the emails, a teacher with a folder of receipts, and a girl who no longer cared what power looked like. Because now, it was hers. The apology came the next day, and not because Mason wanted to, because he had to. Under pressure from the district, the PTA, and a mounting pile of evidence, the school organized a mandatory assembly labeled Restorative Justice and Student Accountability. The auditorium was packed, but the energy was different this time. No cheering, no applause, just a quiet anticipation like the whole school was holding its breath. Mason stood at the podium, flanked by Principal Hardy and the school counselor, reading from a typed page with shaky hands. He said he was sorry if his words had hurt anyone. He said things had been taken out of context, but that he was committed to learning and growing. But it was hollow. Everyone could hear it. Still, no one interrupted, because they didn't need to. The damage was already done. He looked out across the sea of faces, once filled with admiration, now unmoved. He glanced toward the back of the room where Raya sat with her hood down, her hair pulled back, and her sketchbook closed for once. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She just watched. And that, more than anything, broke him. After the assembly, something shifted. Teachers who had once shrugged off microaggressions started asking more questions. A new student-led coalition called Speak Loud formed within a week, organizing a peer hotline and monthly forums. Ms. Avery and a few brave staff members began reviewing the school's discipline records, finding patterns, exposing gaps. Jules Reyes kept writing, and her story was picked up by a state education blog, sparking a wider conversation about favoritism and administrative silence in schools. As for Raya, she didn't take a victory lap. She didn't want one. She just walked the halls the same way she always had. But this time, people stepped aside, not because she was invisible, but because they saw her now. Mason avoided her entirely, eventually withdrawing his name from the class president ballot. His posters disappeared. His confidence cracked. And while he still had friends, fewer now, and quieter, his grip on the school was gone. He wasn't the center anymore, not of the conversation, not of the story. That belonged to someone else, to the girl he called worthless. It happened on a Tuesday, almost 2 weeks after the assembly, when things had started to feel calm again. Too calm. Raya stayed after school to help Miss Avery organize old projectors in the media room, and as she walked alone through the back hallway near the gym, she heard footsteps behind her. Fast, heavy. She didn't have time to react before someone grabbed her shoulder and shoved her hard into the lockers. "You think you ruined me?" Mason hissed, his face flushed, his voice a low snarl. "You embarrassed me. You humiliated my family. My dad lost a city contract because of your lies." Raya didn't move. She kept her breathing steady, her eyes locked on his, calm in a way that infuriated him more. "You ruined yourself," she said simply. "All I did was press play." He stepped closer, and for a second she thought he might actually hit her. But behind him, footsteps echoed again, faster this time. Jordan, Kayla, and two others from Speak Loud turned the corner like a silent army. Mason froze, surrounded by the very students he used to mock. "Get away from her," Kayla said, voice cold and firm. Mason hesitated, then scoffed and backed off, muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Jordan replied. "You just haven't figured it out yet." Miss Avery appeared seconds later, called security, and filed a report herself before Raya even had to say a word. That night, Mason's temporary suspension became indefinite. A formal hearing with the school board was scheduled. His father's connections couldn't stop it this time. Too much attention, too much documentation. Raya sat on her bed that night with the familiar sketchbook in her lap, but she didn't draw Mason. She drew the hallway, the moment, the people who stepped in without being asked. She drew herself, not hiding, not shrinking, just standing tall, unshaken. She realized then that bravery didn't always look like a microphone or a big speech. Sometimes it looked like saying nothing while someone showed the world exactly who they were, and letting the truth do the rest. By the time spring rolled in, Jefferson High felt like a different school. Not perfect, not fixed, but changed. The administration rolled out new guidelines for handling student complaints, and for the first time, anonymous reports were taken seriously. Speak Loud became an official student organization, with Raya quietly serving as its creative lead, designing posters, zines, and graphics that made their message impossible to ignore. Ms. Avery was promoted to advisor for the school's Equity Task Force. Jules Reyes's article was nominated for a state journalism award. And as for Mason Carr, he withdrew from Jefferson a month later. No big announcement, no goodbye party, just a name taken off the candidate list and a locker left empty. Rumors said his family moved him to a private school across town, where he kept his head down and stopped speaking over people. Raya never celebrated it out loud, but she felt it every time someone stood up in class without fear. Every time a teacher gave a shy kid space to speak. Every time someone looked her in the eye and said thank you like they really meant it. On the last day of school, she walked past the same row of lockers where she'd once been humiliated. This time, she paused. Someone had scribbled a quote on the wall in black Sharpie. "The quietest voices can start the loudest revolutions. No name, no tag, just truth." Raya smiled, tugged her sketchbook tighter under her arm, and walked forward. Not as the girl who stayed quiet, not as the girl who needed to be seen, but as a girl who made the whole school finally listen.